Hi there and welcome from all of us at Common Sense to this conversation of fraught future, pressures and stresses in our kids' lives. I'm Lisa Solomon and I manage the nonprofit's Connected Schools program, which is a community of more than 100 mostly independent schools who, among many other things, make these important free webinars happen. If your school isn't a member and you want to learn more, please get in touch. I'll be sure to put my email in the chat shortly. Before I get to our panelists and moderator, just a few housekeeping items. Our team has reviewed all of the thoughtful questions you've submitted ahead of time, and many have been threaded into our prep for today. So thanks for those. If you're joining us live, feel free to share comments in the chat as well as new questions, and we'll pass those along to the panel. We'll also add relevant resources in the chat, so keep an eye on that. And finally, a quick disclaimer, today's content is general and for educational purposes. If you feel that you or your children are in crisis and need specific support, please seek professional help from a healthcare or mental health provider. So today's topic is about the pressures and stresses in our kids' lives. This is an issue we hear about a lot. As we all know, it can be tough balancing family, school, and friends, and it's certainly not easy for parents either. Just a few months ago, the U.S. Surgeon General cited parental stress as a public health issue. This conversation won't be about fear-mongering or guilt-making, but rather we want to offer solutions and help us parse through common sense research to find out why kids may be feeling burnt out and stressed. And despite being in the title of this webinar, I don't really believe any of our guests really think that the future is fraught. But we know that kids and parents and caregivers sometimes think and feel that it is. The work of growing up and parenting our kids has perhaps never been more complicated. But let's take a collective deep breath. Our panelists are here to offer useful strategies as well as talking points to help you best support your kids. So let me get to introductions. First up is Dr. Emily Weinstein, and she's one of the principal authors of Common Sense's newest research report titled Unpacking Grind Culture in American Teens, Pressure, Burnout, and the Role of Social Media. Emily is the co-founder of the Center for Digital Thriving at Harvard Graduate School of Education, which Common Sense has had a long-standing relationship. She's also a collaborator on Common Sense's K-12 digital citizen curriculum. She and Dr. Carrie James wrote the book Behind Their Screens, What Teens Are Facing and Adults Are Missing, based on their original research with more than 3,000 US teens. She's also co-creator of the parenting platform Tech Without Stress. Emily joins our next guest, Jennifer Wallace, who's an award-winning journalist and the author of the best-selling book, Never Enough: When Achievement Culture Becomes Toxic and What to Do About It. Jennifer describes the toxic achievement culture with honesty and insight, and also has a new book coming out soon as well called Mattering in the Modern World, a solution for the crises of our time. So enough from me. I'm now delighted to bring in today's moderator, my colleague, Dr. Supreet Mann. She's Director of Research here at Common Sense Media and also one of the authors, along with Emily Weinstein and others, of our recent research about teens and grind culture. So she's the ideal person to steer this discussion. Supreet, I'm handing the baton over to you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you both, Emily and Jennifer. So in a few words about our research before we get started, in addition to the folks at the Center for Digital Thriving, we also collaborated with Sarah Conrath from Indiana University. The research that we're really going to be highlighting today surveyed over 1,500 teens aged 13 to 17 and asked teens about 6 specific pressures that they're facing, such as the pressure to look a certain way, the pressure to be an activist. It also asked teens about burnout and self-care practices. So let's get into it. Emily, let's start with you. The idea for this research comes from your team's prior work with youth around pressures and mental health. Can you let us in on how you arrived at this particular research project and maybe even describe some of the questions that you had along the way?
Yes, and thanks so much for having me. This new report has a number of really important and interesting insights. And I'm so glad we have this time today to talk about them, and especially to get to do so with Jennifer Wallace. Her book, Never Enough, shaped our thinking in some really key ways. And then I went to her as our team was puzzling through some of the findings and trying to make sense of the data. And she was such a generous thought partner. So I feel really fortunate to be in conversation with her today. So let me back up a little bit. A few years ago, our research team set out to understand how teens think about the connections between tech and mental health. This is obviously a topic that a lot of us feel deep urgency around, trying to understand what's really behind trends in adolescent mental health, where tech is and isn't playing a role. And we do a lot of our work with teens, alongside teens. And interestingly, some of our teen advisors told us that we needed to actually widen our lens, that if we wanted to understand the tech piece, we actually needed to look beyond it. And that advice is what ultimately led us to this new research report where we report on our data exploring burnout and grind culture. So this study is really about what we can learn when we start with a focus on the teen instead of a focus on the tech. And when we ask questions like, what's hard for you right now? And then how does tech play a role? How is it intersecting with those challenges?
Thank you so much, Emily. And thank you, Supreet and Common Sense, for having me here today. I am thrilled to join this conversation. And what I love about this conversation is that it's going to be so much more nuanced than some of the conversations that we've been having lately around tech. I realized as when Emily reached out to me that if we were simply looking through the lens of social media to see the impact on our youth today, we would be missing the whole picture of what's going on. Kids are struggling indeed, but the data on social media suggests that it's a relatively small part of the picture, not insignificant, but social media alone does not cause mental health issues. Other things matter as much or even more. How our teens are using social media. Do they have nourishing friendships in real life? Are they sleeping the right amount? Do they have a caring adult in their lives? When we overly focus on social media, what I fear is that we as parents can take our eyes off the ball and miss the bigger picture that surrounds teen mental health.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for that perspective, and I think Jenny, your point about the nuanced conversation. There's been a lot of focus, of course, on the risks, and we're thinking about questions around how we grapple with the reality that tech is really both. It's connecting and it's dividing. It can be a source for teens of feeling really seen, but also of feeling really invisible, of feeling really inspired, and also heartbroken. Sometimes feeling really energizing, and sometimes really exhausting. And they are using tech in the context of very full lives that have a lot of other meaningful elements and a lot of other contributors. So in this study, we're really widening our lens to try and understand more about what they're feeling and facing. And what's really important about what we found is that it suggests that social media may not be the root of this problem, as so much of, I think, what most of us feel like we're hearing is telling us what we see in the news. And this doesn't mean that it's not playing a role, and for some teens, a really important role. But there's more to the story, and getting curious about the fuller story is such an important part of illuminating, I think, for all of us, the path forward. So maybe, Supreet, before I pass back to you, I'll just say that grind culture, which is the sort of in the title of this report, it was explained to us as this sense of always needing to be productive, to be doing something, to be striving in all these different areas, even at the expense of your health. So it's this feeling that if you're not always performing in some way, you're actually not enough.
That's great. And I think it really does a nice job of setting up what we were trying to do here. And Jenny, your work syncs with this topic so perfectly. Can you take a little bit of time to talk about how your interest developed around these topics and how it syncs up with our work on the grind culture?
Yeah, so I've been writing about this topic for the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post for about 5, 6, 7, 8 years as a journalist. But I've also been seeing how grind culture is taking root. I was seeing it in my own home with my own 3 teenagers. So let me just sort of zoom out and talk quickly about an article that I wrote in 2019 for the Washington Post. It was covering 2 national policy reports. These reports were written by our country's leading developmental experts. And what they were naming were who are the kids who are most at risk for negative health outcomes in today's America. They named children with incarcerated parents. They named children living in poverty. They named the children of recent immigrants who have few resources. They named children living in foster care, and then they named a new at-risk group, children attending what the researchers were calling high-achieving schools. Those are public and private schools all around the country that are generally well-resourced. The kids go off to competitive four-year colleges. What these researchers were finding was that students attending these schools were 2 to 6 times more likely to suffer from clinical levels of anxiety and depression, and 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from substance abuse disorder than the average American teen. Now, to be clear, because your children attend high achieving schools does not mean they are going to have clinical levels of anxiety and depression. But what it means is that there is an increased risk to going to these schools. So for the book, I went in search of the kids who were doing well despite the pressure. I wanted to know what they had in common. What was home life like? How did they experience school and their teachers? What did they see as their role in the wider community? And I found about a dozen or so threads that these healthy strivers, as I call them in the book, have in common. I get into it at length in the book, but really what it boiled down to was that the kids who were doing well felt like they mattered for who they were deep at their core, away from their achievements and successes. And I'm sure we're going to be getting into that in a few more minutes. So I will leave my long explanation there.
That's great. And we've been talking about some of these pressures that teens are feeling. Emily, I'll bounce it back to you. Can you describe some of these pressures?
Sure. So one thing that we heard from teens early on in this research was that performing actually means different things for different teens. So in some cases, it's around school, academics. It can also come up around sports, or around even feeling like you have to carve a unique path for yourself and your future career. It comes up around feeling like you have to, feeling pressure around appearance, feeling pressure around your social life, even around feeling pressure to be a good friend and what it means to be a good friend, for example, in a world where we have 24/7 potential access to each other. Does being a good friend mean you have to always be available to others? So we looked in this particular report at 6 different pressures related to achievement, appearance, social life, friendships, activism, and this idea of having a game plan for your future. We also looked at burnout. So this was one of our co-authors, my colleague Sarah Conrad's idea, and I'm so glad she had this instinct, because when we asked teens, they talked about burnout with such vivid language, like feeling, one of the quotes was like, feeling like a train who's burnt off every ounce of fuel that's left, but still hasn't reached the station. And I think as adults who care deeply about teens, we have to be asking ourselves, what is this station that some teens are running out of fuel trying to reach? And if absolutely nothing else, how do we help them refuel or avoid actually getting to empty in the first place? And so disentangling the roles of some of these pressures and also trying to understand some of the protective practices that help refuel or prevent that train from getting to empty, but also really grappling with that question of what is this station and how is this sort of outcome orientation shaping the way teens are thinking and feeling?
I think that is, I would love to just chime in here quickly to say, I think you've hit on such important points, Emily, that when you think back to when we were growing up, we had protective factors in place. We felt like, our friendships were deep. Sure, there was a little bit of competition, but we were not needing to feel like we had to break our necks to really stick out in a sea of high achievers, to get that coveted spot in AP calculus or a highly selective college with their dwindling acceptance rates. And so when I think about all of these factors, friendships, Relationships with teachers and coaches can also feel fraught, right? Feeling like you always have to win, that every win sets the bar to even higher expectations. Relationships with parents can feel fraught when, as a student, you feel perhaps incorrectly that your parents' love is conditional. So what we're talking about is these risks that are new to our young people that we didn't necessarily have growing up, and how important it is to put these protective buffers back into place for young people. So I think at this point, Emily, why don't you maybe let's just like dig into the findings.
Okay, great. So I think one of the things that really stood out to me was that this game plan pressure, something that I don't think we would have even known to frankly look at as distinct from achievement, was actually the most prevalent pressure we face. And I think we might have another slide before this one that just has sort of the percentage, the different pressures named. Okay, so you can see the different pressures we asked about here. And if we hadn't started with the teen voices and really leaned on them as an anchor, I don't think we would have necessarily ended up with this set, but this was ultimately the set of pressures that came from our initial work with teens as we were really trying to understand specifically the ways that pressure might be intersecting with tech. And I know we'll talk about that more in a minute. But I want to say something about this idea of this game plan pressure. So we found that it is something like 56% of American teens, it is something that 56% of American teens are feeling. This feeling that they have to have their future path totally clear and set. And we actually had some teens, I was on a panel, doing a panel with some teens last week. We were talking about this report, and it's of course so interesting because these are nationally representative data. And we know teens are telling us like these numbers feel much higher in some school communities than others. And this particular pressure, this is so interesting to me as an adolescent psychologist, because developmentally, we tend to think about the importance of teen years as a time for exploration, for the identity work of figuring out who you are and who you want to be. And yet we have teens telling us that there's no time for that, and that they feel like they're doing something wrong if they haven't actually figured it out so that they can be actively working towards that particular path.
I have to say this really, your findings also are very similar to what I found in interviewing hundreds of young people. And it reminded me of conversations that I seem to have over and over again, which was this mistaken notion that a good life is found by going to a good college. I think much of this grind culture is rooted in the idea that there is only one path to success, and that everyone is fighting for this increasingly narrow path to success. I think most adults in our lives, we have the perspective to know that where you go to college has little to do with your well-being, professional success, but our kids don't know that. They believe there is a formula. They believe that that they should be just sort of overcoming developmental milestones and figuring out who they are. Rather, they find that they should be spending their time really working towards this ultimate goal for a good life, which is a good college. And, you know, as your research is pointing out, it can really set them up for such negative health outcomes.
I'm really interested in thinking with you about this, because one of the things we found was that game plan was number one and achievement was number two in terms of prevalence, coming in this close second, 53%. So over half of teens saying they're really feeling negative pressure. We asked specifically about pressure that's making them feel bad. We know, of course, we should have probably said at the outset, of course, not all pressure is negative. Some can be really motivating and productive, but we were really interested in the pressure that we think of as linked to what they talk about as grind culture. So in that negative realm. And I'm curious, just you've done so much thinking about achievement. How do you think we actually got here with kids feeling so much worse in this, seemingly worse? Is it worse in this generation? And what does the achievement pressure really look like in your conversations with teens and parents? And where do you think it's coming from?
I do think it's worse. I don't think it's simply that we're better at naming our feelings. I think that there has been this rise. I think parents feel it. Young people are feeling it. There are a few reasons for this rise, this sort of boiling point now when it comes to achievement. But the reason that resonates most with me is the economic story. So when I was growing up in the 70s and the early 80s, life was generally more affordable. Housing was more affordable, healthcare was more affordable, higher education was more affordable. So there was slack in the system. Parents like mine could be relatively assured that even with some setbacks, even with a B minus in AP calculus, like I got my senior year, that most likely I'd be able to replicate my own childhood as an adult, if not do even better than my own parents did. But we modern parents, we are facing a different reality. We are seeing the first generation, the millennials, who on average are not doing as well as their parents. We have felt the crush of the middle class. We have seen the steep inequity that's been ushered in over the last few decades. And, whether or not parents are aware of it, what I heard over and over again, not so explicitly as I'm about to say it now, but from the parents was that they were betting big, that early childhood success, getting their kids into a quote unquote good college, they hoped would act as a kind of life vest in a sea of economic uncertainty. We can't control for macroeconomic forces. AI is now on the scene, disrupting everything. It's always been the job of a parent to prepare a child to thrive when we're no longer around, but never has that future felt so fraught. These are real stressors. These are real issues that parents are contending with. It doesn't mean to let us off the hook, though. I want to also underscore that the parents are the pressure that our kids are feeling. It's really coming from every direction. It's coming from coaches who feel stressed to deliver wins because so many students and parents are banking on scholarships for college. It's from teachers whose performance reviews are often linked with standardized test scores. So even activities for young people that used to be stress reducing, like playing tennis or dance, now has some sort of achievement attached to them. The bar just keeps rising and rising. That is how it felt for so many of the young people I spoke with.
So one of the things that I'm thinking about as you're talking is I know that you and I talked a lot as I was trying to make sense with our team of these social media findings. And we kept coming back to this idea of what is at the root here. And I think that one of the things that was really hard as a researcher was so often we are looking for social media as the root. And yet we were seeing that we sort of needed to almost flip the way we were thinking to really look at maybe the idea of these other pressures of achievement culture as the root, and then think about how the intersections with social media and different technologies could be so amplifying, or in some cases reducing. But your description about these broader factors, first of all, it feels in some ways really validating for me as a parent to hear you naming those things. But it also has me thinking about two examples that I've heard recently. One was from teens who are responding to some of this research, and they were talking about the trend on TikTok of posting all your stats, and these accounts where people will post, or accounts will consolidate and repost an example of your SAT scores, your GPA, all your extracurricular activities, maybe even your college essay topic, and then where you actually got in and got rejected. And teens who were in this conversation recently, who are juniors and seniors, were saying this is so stressful because it's not only like you feel like the stakes of getting that B minus or B plus or whatever it is are so high, but you're actually getting this kind of evidence and this reminder of it through your feed. And that can ramp up this pressure that you're already feeling. So that's one example. The second is I heard a coach recently talking about this experience that he was observing around his track high school students and Strava. And this idea that Strava is like providing this constant access to see people's metrics. And so you not only are thinking about your own running time, but how your time is comparing to that of your competition, your peers three towns over, or even in some cases 3 states away. And it's even during the off season. So there is this constant feeling of how do I measure up? And these metrics can sort of reinforce the anxiety that there are very limited spots on track teams. There are few scholarships that are so critically needed for some teens to be able to actually, for many teens, to actually even attend these schools that they've been told are crucial and critical links to success. And so again, this really interesting way that we can see this sort of collision of an app and these metrics sort of amplifying pressures that maybe have other roots. And I especially think that Strava example is really interesting because I know you and I both get to talk to a lot of different school communities, and I have not had a single parent ask an audience question yet that is like in the realm of like, do you think that Strava is causing anxiety for this whole generation? And Strava is like never even coming up. And I think it's such a reminder of why you and I both feel such a strong sense that we need to look at the roots, because it feels like otherwise we will just be playing an endless game of whack-a-mole with new technologies that keep cropping up, amplifying challenges that are really cultural.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So we've talked a lot about the pressures that kids are feeling, but in the short term, what are some of the ways individual parents can help take the lid off some of these pressures and expectations? What is it about in the moment what can parents do in those moments when stress is really high or a kid is kind of beating themselves up about this?
Yeah, Jenny, go ahead.
Well, I mean, one of the things I will say is I interviewed Sonia Luther, who recently passed away, but she was one of the world's leading researchers on youth resilience and also caregiver resilience. And I remember interviewing her, and I said to her, okay, if I know my kids are at risk, what can I do at home to buffer against this pressure or take the lid off, as you put it in your question? And she said a phrase to me, which has really become a kind of North Star. And it's this. She said, minimize criticism, prioritize affection. What she was saying to me was to make home a kind of haven of mattering and self-worth, a place where our kids never had to feel like they had to prove themselves worthy of love. So how do we do that? Minimizing criticism. It means when our kids inevitably disappoint us, it is separating the deed from the doer. So you are not wrong. Your behavior might be wrong. Something you're doing may be falling short, but you yourself are worthy no matter what. And when I think about prioritizing affection, I think about greeting your kids at least once a day the way the family dog greets you, with just total joy. I'll say something else I learned in the research is that, this is the major developmental task for any adolescent is to develop a sturdy sense of self. But when we feel like our sense of self is contingent, is sort of wrapped up in our achievements, that's when achievement culture becomes toxic. And so at home, our job is to help our kids untangle their self-worth from their achievements. And one of the ways, there are many ways to do this. One way to do this is what I say in the book is to get a PhD in your child. Get to know them intimately. What is it about them deep at their core that you can point out and admire? Maybe it's a great sense of humor. Maybe it's that they are highly empathic with family, friends, but even strangers. There are so many ways that we can communicate to our kids who they are deep at their core and that we value who we are deep at their core. And I'll just say there may be some families on here saying, okay, but what happens when our kids are not sort of rising to the occasion, not giving it what they should be giving it towards their achievements? How can we encourage them to reach for higher goals, to put in the work without crushing them? And I'll tell you one simple phrase that Madeline Levine, who's a child psychologist in California, gave me. And she said, when our kids are not performing well, to get curious, not furious. She said, all children, just like adults, want to do well. So if they aren't performing, figure out what may be underlying that. Is it perhaps a learning difference that's gone undiagnosed? Is it that they may be having, peer relationship issues, which can hijack cognitive resources that should be spent studying in the classroom. So as a parent, if your child isn't performing, a way to minimize the criticism is to get curious, not furious. Let them know you're on their team. Let them know you believe in them. Let them know that they matter no matter what in your house. Do everything you can to really counter those toxic messages in the environment.
Oh my gosh, so many gems, so many gems. I love so many of those. I especially love the idea of greeting your children once a day, like the family dog would greet everyone. I think that's so actionable and something that we really all can do today. It's like a completely free intervention. And of course, I love the idea of getting a PhD in your kids. I think about two things in particular. One is that we asked teens this question when we were doing the co-interpretation. So one thing we did when we were doing the study was after we did the survey, we brought the findings to teens, and we had 19 teens who actually over the course of repeated sessions with us dug into the data with us, and we were talking to them about what they saw in the data and also what they wanted adults to know. And they had some really good insights. One of them was around the power of parents to help prevent overload. And I think I have a quote. Yeah, I do. I want to just read a quote that was from one of the teens in our groups that I think really, it will stick with you. I think one of the things she said, one of the things my parents told me a lot is take a lot of opportunities that interest you or whatever, and be really open. But the more important thing they told me was don't take every opportunity.
Mm.
And I wonder, I've heard you talk about this idea of taking the kettle off the heat, and I wonder if you could just explain that metaphor, because I think that it will help give some stickiness to this really important young person's perspective around how parents can help.
I'd love to. I just want to acknowledge that Supreet's Wi-Fi keeps going out, which is why you're not seeing her. And so we're just going to keep the conversation going. Hopefully she'll be able to make another appearance, but she may not. So taking the kettle off the heat was advice that I got from one of the parents of the healthy strivers that I talked to. She said to me, and I've sort of adopted this philosophy in my own house since talking to her. She said she found it as her job not to encourage every one of her kids' goals, but instead to be thoughtful about how much he put on his plate and to create kind of guardrails for his life. She saw herself almost as his prefrontal cortex, that he felt like he needed to take every opportunity, but she felt like it was her job to sometimes say no, to say, you are worthy of rest. You are worthy of a full night's sleep. Not only are you worthy, but in this house, these are our values. Our physical health and mental health come first. And so time and time again, she would pull him back. She would be the guardrails for him. What I heard from so many of the kids who did not know how to decompress, how to give themselves permission to get off the treadmill from time to time, to push through burnout, was that these were the same kids who talked to me about needing to drink to black out on the weekends, that this was their way of shutting it down because they did not have the tools, the coping skills, the mental health and mental perspective to say, I am worthy of rest. And so what I've come to believe in my own life as a parent is that one of my critical jobs in raising my 3 teenagers in my house is to help them build the kind of life that they don't need drugs and alcohol to escape from. And so I find myself going back time and time again to something Challenge Success, which is a nonprofit in California. They call it that every young person, every teen should every day have PDF in their life. Playtime, downtime, and family time. And so when my kids are creating their schedules, I am clear with them about what our values are as a family, that they are going to have to sleep. The lights will go off, that they need downtime, and we need time together as a family, that's just something that we do in our house. So these are just some of the ways I think that we could help take the kettle off the heat for our own children, and really teach them how to build a balanced life, a healthy life.
We asked about a number of sort of these protective practices and these different self-care activities, these rest activities in the study, actually. And one of the things that was really interesting was that while our data suggests that teens are doing self-care activities, they're doing them less often than daily, and these pressures are daily. And it can make it really difficult when they don't have these sort of release valves to actually let go of the daily pressures. And so it's not only that they're not getting these kind of essential building blocks of a healthy, well-rounded day, but also that they're actually in our data, we see like they're really missing in some cases core practices like getting enough sleep and getting exercise, having meaningful conversations with friends and peers, which we know is so important developmentally, getting outside and having time in nature. And I think one of the things that was really interesting to me was as we were looking with teens at the data on self-care practices, on these healthy practices, we heard something that really resonates with what you were just describing. So we were asking them what gets in the way of doing these practices, what gets in the way of getting sleep, of spending time just doing things that are creative or for fun or being outside. And one of the things that we heard, one of the emotions that came up was a lot of guilt. It was like, I feel guilty when I am doing those things. And there was this sense that even your self-care should be productive. I remember this theme that came up around, well, some kinds of self-care are more productive than others because you actually have something to show for it at the end. And I remember a teen sharing like, I would like to be outside in nature, but it just kind of feels like a waste of time because I have nothing to show for it. At least if I'm going to practice, I'm like getting time, I'm getting exercise, and I can kind of put it on my resume or on my college application. And we were in one group and a teen started talking about how guilty she felt reading for pleasure. And I feel like that was such an aha moment to me that the barriers, some of them are for sure, some of them are schedule wise, right? Like they're practical. It's about not having time. Some of them are about tech. Sometimes we turn to tech and it's as an sort of an easy way to try and relieve stress. And there are other activities that might help us feel better. Maybe not. I think we could talk about that in a sec, about the sort of dual roles of tech, but also that there is actually this sense that even my self-care should be productive and that it's not a good use of my time necessarily to be prioritizing sleep or these other things. And so what you said about the signal from adults who are in teens' lives that this is so important, this is something we value, I think is actually a crucial part of the intervention, because otherwise we will create space, but we will not have actually addressed one of the key barriers that they're feeling.
Well, I think as you're talking, it's definitely something that I personally struggle with. This idea of downtime when I'm writing a book, promoting another book, have 3 teenagers, helping to run a busy family life. And what I really try to do is to be mindful in my house of modeling. So even if I'm embarrassed to say this, but even if I don't necessarily want to give myself a break, I have found it important to show my kids that I do, because when I don't do that, when I just keep pushing through and my kids don't see me sitting down and relaxing, what they see is a woman who feels like her worth is tied to her productivity. And so one of the things that I've actually started doing, as you mentioned, I'm writing my second book. And what I'll do sometimes when my kids are doing their homework and, the evening starts to get late, I will close my laptop and I'll say out loud to myself, well, Jenny, that's enough for the day. You've done enough work. Now it's time to relax, go take a bath, read your book. And I literally make it a point as much as I can to show my kids how I grant myself downtime, how I treat myself at home like I matter. So, not to guilt us parents, but truly just for us to be mindful of what it is that we are modeling and how we are talking about downtime, how we are talking. There was one dad that I interviewed for the book who felt like downtime for his son, downtime with friends, was a waste of time. And he said he can make friends later in life. Right now, he has to achieve. And I understood where the father was coming from. I wasn't judging. But boy, how important friendships are for our development. We can't just skip those developmental milestones in the effort to achieve. So anyway, I think just to underscore the point that we as parents really need, as much as we can, to model that value of ourselves, our own self-care, our own downtime, recognizing that we get the proper amount of sleep so that we can show them how to build a healthy life.
Your comments are also making me want to go back to our social media conversation a little bit, because I think that is an area where I think a lot about my own modeling around my own tech habits, especially, and my phone. So that feels like, gosh, that feels like it looms large for a lot of us. Like, what do our kids see when they see us interacting with our technology, and the pull to check our email or respond to a text right away? And one of the things that was really interesting in looking at the data for this study was that we repeatedly see in the data that the experiences around tech are different for different kids. So they're not just having a uniform experience. Some are struggling more, some are finding much more support and positives that are really outweighing the downsides. You used the word havens before, and it made me think about some work that one of our Center for Digital Thriving Fellows, Molly Josephs, is doing around digital havens, and the reality that for some teens, there are havens that they find through technology where they feel supported and connected and valued, and many of these things that we're really looking for. And you talked about the power of curiosity. And I think that we see such a data-driven call for action around this idea of curiosity, because when we recognize that actually for some kids, social media is amplifying pressures in really pronounced ways. I would say across the board, we see appearance pressure, social life pressure, and activism pressure can be sort of especially magnified for teens by social media. And I think that's not a huge surprise. And some teens are feeling those pressures more than others. Some are feeling them more amplified by social media than others. For some, they're telling us it's mixed. Sometimes social media makes it better. Sometimes it makes it worse. And then they're saying, like, not all tech is the same. So we see really clearly in these data that gaming can be a kind of release valve for teens. They're saying that it's much less likely to actually contribute to pressure, and it's either not relevant to the pressure they're feeling, or in some cases, it's really a way that they're sort of releasing and letting off steam, at least temporarily, sort of letting go of some of those pressures. So I think that the guidance that you gave in general around getting curious, it's all the more important when we look at social media, gaming, tech, because one of the things we know is that there is a ton of variation in what kids are experiencing with tech. And if we want to understand when it's functioning as a risk, when there are more benefits that we might want to be alert to, so we think a little differently about screen time, we have to start with asking questions rather than just making assumptions. And for many of us, that requires a really intentional pivot from assuming to asking, because the headlines that we've seen have reinforced so many strong, I think, instinctive beliefs that there is this really flat, monolithic experience for kids, that it's all bad, and that we should be feeling really guilty about any tech time that we let our kids have.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. I'm so glad you raised that. I mean, what I say in the book, and what I say when I speak with parents, is that for modern parents today, we should be as curious about what's going on in our children's online world as we are what's going on in the cafeteria table or what's happening on Friday nights. But we really do a disservice to our relationship with our kids when we just decide blanketly that all social media is bad. It's, as you pointed out in your research, it varies by each child. We need to be getting PhDs in our kids and understanding our children. I mean, I think one way for parents to look at this is that if you have a child who is struggling with excessive envy, excessive social comparison, impulse control issues, then you should be concerned that your child might not be using social media in ways that are helpful to them. But if you have a child who is, has strong friendships in real life, goes outside, has the right amount of sleep, seems to have coping skills to deal with, feelings of envy, which, as I call in my book, they are the elephant in the room when it comes to achievement pressure, both online and offline. Are these feelings of envy? And just one, quick thing that I found so useful in talking about envy with my own kids is to normalize the idea that we all feel envy, right? We all feel it. We have been given this feeling of envy through evolution for healthy adaptive reasons. We don't have to judge ourselves, I tell my kids, for feeling envy, but we do have to hold ourselves accountable for how we act on that envy. So when feelings of envy inevitably bubble up, we should say to our kids, talk to us. Let me help you with those feelings and talk them through. You have two choices when these feelings bubble up. You could take the unhealthy route, which I wouldn't recommend, which is cutting somebody down and gossiping about them so you feel better by comparison. Or we could take the healthy envy route. We could get curious about our feelings of envy. What is it that this other person has that I think is so important? And then instead of ruining the relationship with gossip, how about we go to that person, the source of our envy, and say, I so admire what you have done here. I would love to try it myself. Is there something that, something that I could be doing in my own life to help reach this goal? So again, for our kids, it's talking about, it's getting into these deep conversations, getting curious. Why do you follow this person? What do you think about them? What's popular on TikTok right now? What's trending? Or asking them these questions, meeting them, on the same level field and asking them questions about what they're seeing and what their on-life life is.
Yeah. And I think a developmental perspective is so helpful here too, because one of the things we know is that your sort of tendency, your curiosity, and your instinct to compare yourself to others, that increases as we enter puberty, as we go through adolescence. And there are some really adaptive, useful reasons for that and functions of it. So you might remember that I have a 5-year-old right now. So my 5-year-old might say, like, I'm the best swimmer in the whole world, or I'm the best artist in the whole world. And one of the things that starts to happen during adolescence is we actually do these processes of comparing ourselves, and ultimately it helps us get a more realistic sense of our own abilities, and we realize that maybe we are not the best swimmer in the whole world, and we can come out the other side with a sense of that, I love swimming, or I'm a strong swimmer, or whatever it is. I love art. But one of the things that can happen is that it can really impact our self-esteem, our confidence, initially, when we have this sense of, if I'm not the best, then what am I and who am I? And one of the realities is that if we are not ready to help, if we are not there and ready to help kids answer that question, they will look to places like social media to get the answers. And social media is a place where we know that compare it can be really ripe for comparison. We talk about this, Carrie and I talk about this idea of comparison quicksand, which can happen on social media, where you're just like pulled into this sort of thinking spiral. Like, everyone is happier than me. Everyone has better friends than me. And I think that you named something so important, which is that one of the paths forward, one of the ways out of that spiral is name it to tame it. So actually name that feeling of envy, of comparison, normalize that feeling comes up, talk about it, and talk about what to do about it. I think that is exactly where you were guiding us. If we just leave kids totally to their own, I think one of the things that happens is they start feeling like something is wrong with them for having this experience. And I just remember so clearly when we were talking about social comparison and social media with teen advisors for our book, that one of the big takeaways they had was like, I can't believe other people feel this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know, normalizing it.
We have this sense that, like, oh, everyone's comparing themselves on Instagram, and that's sort of a reality check for a lot of us. But the truth is that, I will never forget teens being like, the most interesting thing I took away from this whole conversation was like, I can't believe other people have that same thought in their head that I have. Like, everyone else seems happier, everyone else seems to have more friends. So the power of naming the elephant in the room, as you called it, I think is so real.
Well, we're giving a lot of useful, hopefully, advice to parents, but I'm recognizing that everything we are saying, from the modeling to being, as curious about our child's online life as we are, as we are in their real life, all of these things take bandwidth on the part of a parent. And I don't have to tell the parents listening here. I also have 3 teens. I know how hard it is to parent today. And so for the book, I really wanted to look at what gives parents the resilience we need to be those sturdy sources of support for our kids, to have the energy, to keep the curiosity, to minimize the criticism, to prioritize the affection, all of the things to help our kids uncouple their achievements from their sense of worth, to really be the buffer against the toxic messages everywhere coming in every direction. What gives parents that bandwidth? And so I looked at the research and I, read through, decades worth of resilience research. And the finding that surprised me the most is that a child's resilience rests fundamentally on the resilience of the adults in their lives, and that our resilience as parents rests on the depth and support of our relationships. So we are often sold a bill of goods by the multi-billion-dollar wellness industry to download this app or soak in this bubble bath or light this expensive candle and you'll be resilient. Those are great stress reducers, but they do not give us the resilience that we need to be the first responders to our kids' struggles day in and day out. And the only thing that does that are deep, supportive relationships. So, it wasn't, and when I was interviewing parents in these high achieving communities, it wasn't that they didn't have friends. They had friends. What they often didn't have was the time or the bandwidth to invest in those friends so that they could be sources of support when they needed them. We are often told as parents to put on our oxygen mask on first. But what I'm saying today, right now, goes deeper than that. I am saying find 1 or 2 people in your life, friends outside of your home, that you can open up with, that you can be vulnerable with, and that they could be vulnerable with you. So that when you are struggling, when you are gasping for air, they hear it and they reach over and put that oxygen mask on for you. That is a very different level of support than we normalize in today's, busy culture. But if there's one thing you take out of this talk from me today, I hope it is this: to prioritize your relationships outside of the home, to invest in those friendships. Doesn't mean hours a week of investment. Researchers have found it requires just 1 hour a week of intentional time of being vulnerable so that we can be that sturdy source of support for our kids. We know our kids need a sturdy source of support. Well, guess what? These sturdy sources of support, we adults, we also need sturdy sources of support to lean on too.
Oh, what a valuable set of actionable things that we can do right now. I love that direction. I also think that we both feel and really acknowledge as we have that conversation that resilience is around stress, and that there are parents that just have absolutely disproportionate amounts of stress on them, and that we are operating in a system that has made it such that the oxygen masks feel out of reach for a lot of parents, and that one of the things that we will have to address if we want to make things much easier for our teens is how to alleviate some of the burdens that parents are rightly feeling in this system. I'm really motivated by your actionable. Here are things that people can do, because I think that feels really big. And while it's important to hold on to, it also feels less actionable maybe for Tuesday, December 10th, to tackle everything about these bigger systems. So I want to share in the same spirit, actually, another thing that I think people, parents, and educators can do right now. And I know, Jennifer, your work and our team's work have really centered the importance and the power of values as a core of helping to develop. I know as you talk about a sense of mattering, and as we think about a core sense of your identity and who you are and who you want to be. And one of the resources that our team has worked on with Common Sense is a lesson plan that is totally free, that is it's around tech and values. And it starts by having students think about the values that are most important to them right now. And then it invites them to think about how their experiences with tech can make those values easier or harder. So you think about things like kindness or presence or connection or justice. There are ways that tech can help, and there are ways that tech can be really complicated, and opening up some of those conversations can be a way to talk about tech in new ways, and really lean into the curiosity in a way that also has this really strong core. So that is one of my action items and takeaways. And I'm hoping that maybe someone can drop in the chat the link to the tech and values resources.
I'd love to pipe in a little bit more. One of the big findings in my book was how our values impact our well-being. So just for the sake of time, I'm going to oversimplify my findings. I get into it more at length in the book, but essentially what researchers all across the world have been studying is studying our values and recognizing that we all roughly have about a dozen core values inside all of us. And researchers split it up into intrinsic values and extrinsic values. Intrinsic values are the things Emily was just talking about: kindness, wanting to be pro-social, good to the environment, wanting to grow as a person, being a kind person, a good neighbor. Those are intrinsic values. Extrinsic values are things like wanting popularity, wanting a high status job, or going to the brand name school. Those are extrinsic values. And here's why this is important for parents to keep in mind. Values operate like a zero-sum game. So the more time you spend in your life pursuing extrinsic values, again, going to the good college, getting the brand name job, the less room you have in your life to pursuing intrinsic values. And here's why that matters. The extrinsic values have been linked with negative mental health and substance abuse disorder, whereas intrinsic values are linked with the well-being we want for our kids. And it is not that parents and kids in high-achieving communities have bad values. It's that our extrinsic values are constantly being activated. So what does this mean for parents? This means for parents that at home, we need to be the values balance keepers. Our kids already know we want them to be a success. We are raising them, sending them to high-achieving schools. They are seeing us modeling in our ambitions. They already know this. Let home be a place where you focus, you make an intentional focus on the importance of intrinsic values. Again, it doesn't mean to not want to have shiny things. Yes, have the shiny things, but we have come out of balance. And that is part of what is leading to so much distress. So at home, as much as you can, have 101-minute conversations about values day in and day out, not a yearly lecture like we're prone to giving. Really think about what your values are, communicate them, not just by modeling, but by being, actively talking about these things.
Thank you so much for that perspective, and for layering in the key role that parents can play. I love the idea that we've just now given this sort of two-pronged, like these values conversations. They can happen around tech in the classroom. They can happen, and can happen, should happen, will happen in ongoing ways at home too. I think we just got a question that I want to answer, make sure we answer directly before we pass it back to our Common Sense facilitators, which is around what are some of the, we've talked about tech and how teens have really different experiences, and we've definitely acknowledged there can be real meaningful benefits and upsides. But the question is, what are some of the signs when tech use is becoming problematic, when maybe their habits are really becoming detrimental to their overall well-being? And I wanted to just name sort of 4 indicators that are often talked about in the research around problematic internet use, problematic tech use. And they are importance. And I'm going to tell you what they are, and then I'll give you an example of kind of a question to ask yourself for each one. So importance, control, consequences, and impairment. So let's just quickly, so in case you are in this, the kind of some questions to ask yourself, and this is a whole literature that I will not be able to do justice to in 30 seconds, but in the realm of importance, we ask a question like, have they stopped or cut down on other interests that they have because they just want to be on their device all the time? A lot of us want to and do spend a lot of time on devices, but do you see that the sort of relative importance of tech feels like it's gone up as everything else that really matters is going down? Does it feel like using tech is more important to them than anything else? Control. So do they consistently use tech for much longer than they intended? I want to acknowledge this is a hard one because tech is designed to keep us all using it longer than we intend, but starting to keep an eye on the quantity of use. And then have they continued or even increased tech use despite negative consequences that you're seeing in other areas, maybe on relationships or grades? And then impairment, I just lost my keynote and I want to just make sure I'm giving you the right question. Impairment, yeah. So do you see impairment in other key areas? So family, friends, school, or work. So really thinking about impairment, consequences, control, and importance. These are 4 of the indicators that we can look to. And I really want to encourage you, if you do feel like your teen is not just using a lot of tech, but is using tech in ways that are problematic, that are negatively impacting them, their mental or physical health in other ways, their overall life and well-being, reach out to your child's pediatrician and make sure that you are getting support around that. You are such an important advocate and you know when something is amiss. All right, handing it back over to you, Lisa.
Thank you both so much. I've learned so much, even though I have 2 college kids, but someone in the chat asked if we are talking to college admission officers about all this too. So I think that's really important. I want to thank Jennifer Wallace and Emily Weinstein for this incredible conversation. We're so grateful for your time, your smarts, and your insights here. And I'm going to wrap it up. And I'm going to thank Dr. Supreet Mann too, who had to jump off. She was having internet issues. I'm going to now make sure that you know how to find all of Common Sense's resources. And so before we sign off for today, I'm going to toss to a little short bumper video. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us. And again, Jennifer and Emily, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Common Sense is your family's go-to source for ratings and reviews for everything including movies, games, books, and more. We're also here to support parents and caregivers with guidance on key topics such as screen time, online safety, and social media. Educators can find lesson plans and classroom tech tools. And you can learn about the important advocacy work we do to make tech safer for all kids and families. If you want access to some of our resources on the go, download our app from the App Store or Google Play. This puts our vast library of ratings and reviews right at your fingertips, wherever you are. Stay connected and informed by signing up for our free newsletters, offering everything from movie night inspiration and parenting tips to updates on how you can help us improve the digital world for kids everywhere. Sign up at commonsensemedia.org/newsletters. Supporting Common Sense means you're backing a nonprofit mission dedicated to helping families and educators thrive in a world of media and technology. Thanks for being a part of this important conversation. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more engaging discussions in the future.